Hey, let's look at another clip now. Let's see what this one is here. But there are questions about whether any of the remains could have lasted for 3,500 years.
It's actually kind of problematic to think that anything would have lasted a long time. I mean, the bodies would have been rapidly consumed, plus bones dissolve in seawater, so even if the fish didn't get them, the bones would go away. But anything made of wood is going to decompose really rapidly. But some people are saying that wood has lasted for a long time. Like there's a boat they found in the Sea of Galilee that was actually buried in the mud. And that's the point. It was buried in mud. If the wood is exposed, it's going to get consumed. If it's buried in mud, especially anoxic mud, it can last a very long time. But if the wood is above the sands, it's gone.
However, if giant walls of water came crashing down on the chariots, would the seafloor have been churned up, covering many of the artifacts? Moeller suggests that the wood from the wheels disintegrated and that the coral took its shape, perhaps leaving traces of metal where it reinforced parts of the wheel.
If you were searching the seabed and searching for man-made objects, if you get a positive reading from your magnetometer, it wouldn't necessarily prove that there was a man-made object there, because there are many natural objects which could set off your magnetometer. Where we get our magnets from, of course, is from natural deposits of iron ore and magnetite, and the seabed is a place where many of these compounds do accumulate.
I think I've probably dived on about 10 or 12 different trips. I understand that within coral there are traces of metal, but you can set the frequency of a metal detector so that it doesn't pick up traces of those minerals.
Yeah,
What's
minerals,
really
there might be
is the pattern
uranium inside corals.
We've come across interesting shaped corals, and you run a metal detector around it, things don't quite add up, you'll move on, and you'll find a full circle, perfect dimensions, symmetrical. Then you'll run a metal detector across it and you'll find metal readings in just the right places, where the hub is, where the spokes would be. Too much of a coincidence for me anyway.
Two wheels stand like this, right, with an axle in between.
Right.
Circular shape, right. And this,
I mean, there's no disputing things like that.
For certain, it's not a coral reef.
No, it's not natural.
If you want to find a chariot wheel and it looks like a coral, you have to prove that it's not a coral, because it just looks like the way corals grow.
Yeah.
Even if a chariot wheel was lying on the bottom of the sea and it got encrusted in coral, you wouldn't expect it to maintain that shape over time, because first of all, corals grow. So if you had something that's being encrusted with coral, well, the coral's going to keep on growing, and it's going to all of a sudden not look like a wheel anymore. There's no telling what shape it would take on.
So something that's 3,500 years old wouldn't still look like a chariot wheel. Is that what you're saying?
It shouldn't. The only way to do that would be maybe it got encrusted and then buried in sand, and then maybe recently got re-exposed again. But then you'd have to, again, you have to scientifically examine these. You have to look at each one. You have to ask good questions. You can't just jump in the water and see something round and say, oh, I see a chariot wheel. That's not the way science works.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment. I know that there have been times when, Aaron, you have found something and then it's disappeared the next day when you try to come back, because there's quite a bit of movement there, isn't there, with the sand because of that plateau that's out there. So just tell me a little bit about your experience there.
Well, we used to mark any corals which are interesting to us so that we could get back to them, you know, even a few weeks later on a separate trip. And those markers would always, they were pretty sturdy, they would remain in place. But sometimes the marker would just be marking sand, so we would have to dig down. And I think there were times when sometimes we dug down and didn't even get, it's pretty hard to dig down just with your hands, and we wouldn't even reach the coral. So I don't know how far down it would be. So I think there's quite a lot of movement down there on that seabed. Things can get covered up and uncovered.
Yeah, that's part I found interesting, because that's what I heard before. So Dr. Carter, there does seem to be, because of the, I don't know if it's the tide or what, but you know, there's that lip, and then it's like thousands of feet deep on either side. I don't know if there's this action going on where there's sort of almost like a, you know, like sand on out in the desert that's sort of shifting.
We had a study reef when I was in graduate school that we went to 3 times a week for an entire summer. And a big hurricane blew up in the middle of summer. And even though we had been diving on that reef day after day for weeks and I had memorized individual corals, I didn't recognize what I was looking at when we went back. There were sand piles where there was nothing before, and there were dead coral skeletons that had been exposed when sand that was there was removed. So storms, tides, waves, you probably get some turbidity currents from the fore slope of that of the delta. Every once in a while, you're just going to get a breakaway of a bunch of material and just going to come tumbling down into the depths. And anything just uphill of that's going to reslope and form a new grade. So you can get a lot of changes pretty quickly there.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I like what Andrew is saying is that no one's really, you know, what they really want to do is get real scientists to that location. But one of the challenges is number one is that it's in a complicated area because you've got the Saudis on one side. You know, it's an international area for Israel and Jordan, and you've got the Egyptians. It's not an easy political area to be diving in.
You can only take the boat out. Yeah, you can only take the boat out halfway across the sea because you're then effectively on Saudi territory if you're over halfway. So that limits a lot of what you can do from Egypt. And I think, Ross, you dived down to about 45 meters at one point, and then it just got very, very murky and we lost the light. So we've only really physically explored down to about 40 meters, which is, you know, not that far out. So there's so much more opportunity there to do this and investigate it with modern technology.
And that's a very good point, because really as divers, we've only scratched the surface, so to speak, just around the shoreline. What's out in the deeper water that's been undisturbed by storms and that would be very interesting. And just like to make a couple of points about in the video they talked about the minerals, the metal detectors might be picking up minerals. What you're looking at is basically a sand delta. That delta is built up by sand coming out of the wadi. It's very sorted, if you want to call it that, sifted. We're not looking at a mountain, you know, where you go mining for minerals. We're looking at a seabed that is, what's the right word? Very uniform. It's basically sand. You're not finding mineral deposits.
It's silicon dioxide. You wouldn't expect iron-containing minerals or anything like that there. A coral's not going to be... I don't think natural coral is going to register on a metal detector. I mean, I have some skeletons right behind me on my shelf here, both fossil and modern corals, and there's not really metal content in there.
No, and the point I was making is in the sand you won't find metal content naturally because it's washed out filtered sand, and there aren't any, you know, metal deposits or lodes or whatever you call out there. The other point I'd to make is that the coral is very old, and you on the video you made a point about coral would grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger. But here's the thought too, a lot of the coral there is dead coral. You know that the wadi has flash floods periodic. You know, when you get a large downpour on the Sinai Peninsula, you get a flash flood coming out. And I believe fresh water would kill the coral. So what I'm picturing's happened here is after the Exodus, coral grew until the first flash flood came and probably killed the coral. And so you haven't got necessarily massive coral growth on some of these. Some of them, it hasn't grown much at all, and it's basically dead coral. And so the shape has been preserved in situations, some cases. Other cases, yes, it has grown. It's hard to identify anything. But other cases, the shape is apparent. So, and I'd say it's not simply finding shapes in coral is what points to this area. It's the whole Exodus route, plus the fact that there's metal inside this, you know, in the right shape in these corals. These are all points that add up to this being the right location.